The human with a warning label. The Horizon Seeker was no ordinary research vessel. It was a marvel of Valkyrie engineering, a bioorganic ship grown from crystalline structures rather than constructed from crude metals. It hummed with life, its corridors pulsing faintly with a soft luminescence. The ship's purpose was to explore the unknown, to study new worlds, and to make first contact with emerging species. But today, the crew wasn't meeting a new species. They were meeting a human, a file unlike any other. First Officer Tilks had spent 3 centuries in service aboard the Horizon Seeker. In all that time, he had seen many unusual things: planets made of liquid metal, sentient fungi, stars that pulsed in perfect harmony with thought waves. But nothing unnerved him quite as much as the personnel file floating in front of him. At first glance, it seemed standard. The new crew member was a botanist, requested by the Galactic Science Council for an extended study on adaptive plant species in extreme environments. A simple enough assignment. But one thing was different. At the top of the human's personnel file, flashing in amber warning lights, was a cautionary note unlike anything Tilks had ever seen. His mandibles clicked in agitation as he read the words again. Warning. Human specialist exhibits unconventional problem-solving approaches and high adaptability in crisis situations. Standard protocols may be subject to creative interpretation. Tilks turned to his commanding officer, Captain Vexa, whose crystalline form pulsed with faint amusement. This is unusual, Tilks said carefully, his long fingers hovering over the glowing text. Most species have standard cautionary notes, physiological warnings, environmental needs. But this, his mandibles twitched. I have never seen a warning about problem solving. Captain Vex's crystalline surface shifted hues, a Valkyrie gesture of quiet amusement. That's because you have never worked alongside a human before. Tilks's eyes narrowed. Are they truly so unpredictable? The captain hummed, her voice chiming like wind through crystal. Unpredictable. No. Highly adaptive. Yes, they see problems differently. Their minds do not follow linear pathways like ours. She paused, as if considering her words. It is what makes them unique. Tilks exhaled, his bioluminescent skin flashing a skeptical green. But why this human? Surely there are others with fewer warnings attached to their profiles. Captain Vex's crystalline lattice shimmered in thought. Specialist Kai Chen's work on adaptive plant species in extreme environments is unmatched. Their research on Europa's deep-sea thermal vents revolutionized our understanding of potential life-supporting ecosystems. She gestured toward the file. If the Science Council chose them, they must believe this human's insights are worth the risk. Tilks's mandibles clicked again. I fail to see how a botanist could pose a risk. Captain Vex's glow dimmed slightly. Then you do not yet understand humans. Before Tilks could respond, a chime echoed through the ship. The human had arrived. First impressions. The airlock doors hissed open, revealing the small transport vessel docked with the Horizon Seeker. The lone figure stood at the threshold, gazing into the vast, organic corridors of the ship with keen, analytical eyes. Kai Chen. At first glance, they were unremarkable. Average height, lean build, dark hair neatly tied back, wearing the standard silver-gray research uniform of the Galactic Science Council. But Tilks immediately noticed something unusual. Most new arrivals took time to adjust to the ship's slightly lower gravity. They would stumble, compensate, often require assistance. Not Kai. The human had already adjusted their stance and balance, subtly shifting their posture as if they had instinctively calculated the gravitational difference. Interesting. Captain Vex's crystalline form glowed warmly in greeting. Welcome aboard the Horizon Seeker, Specialist Chen. Kai smiled, a human expression that had always unsettled many alien species. Unlike the Valkyrie's glowing shifts in hue, or the teaser's pheromone-based communication, humans expressed emotion through facial muscles, a habit that many found oddly aggressive. But Kai's smile was calm, measured and knowing. "Thank you, Captain." Their voice was steady, confident. "It's an honor to be here." Tilks's eyes narrowed. There was no hesitation in their voice, no unease. This human was not afraid. An unusual observation. As Captain Vexa led Kai through the twisting corridors of the Horizon Seeker, Tilks silently observed them. Most new crew members, especially from species unfamiliar with bioorganic ships, reacted with a mix of awe and discomfort. The Horizon Seeker was alive, its walls pulsing with faint light, its corridors curving organically rather than following rigid, geometric structures. But Kai, they observed the ship with curiosity, not unease. "Your vessel isn't grown from traditional crystalline structures," Kai noted, running a hand lightly over the walls. "It's a hybrid. The lattice structure suggests biosymbiosis." Tilks blinked. Kai had identified the ship's organic properties instantly, something even experienced scientists took days to understand. Captain Vexa chimed approvingly. "Your insight is sharp, Specialist. Our vessel is a fusion of Velcari crystalline engineering and Tuzur biomechanical augmentation." Kai nodded. "Elegant design. Efficient." Tilks's mandibles twitched. No awe, no shock, just calm analysis. Tilks wasn't sure why, but that unsettled him more than anything else. The warning's true meaning. As they reached the research laboratory, Captain Vexa gestured toward a glowing display. "You will be working primarily in our biospheric study chambers. The planetary samples we collect are stored here for analysis." Kai examined the interface, then paused. A small crease formed between their eyebrows. Something was wrong. Tilks noticed the shift immediately. "Is there a problem, Specialist?" Kai hesitated, then tilted their head slightly. "The atmospheric conditions in the chamber. They're off." Captain Vexa blinked, her crystalline glow flickering slightly. "Explain." Kai tapped the screen. "Your chamber is set to simulate standard atmospheric composition, but the plants in your sample originate from a highly volatile environment. The conditions you've created might appear suitable, but over time, they'll cause instability in the plant's metabolic processes." Tilks frowned. "Impossible. Our models predict stability." Kai exhaled through their nose. Another human habit. Models are great, until reality proves them wrong. Before Tilks could protest, Kai adjusted the environmental parameters, tweaking temperature, oxygen balance, and electromagnetic exposure. Then, without waiting for permission, they initiated a live simulation. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the plant's bioluminescent veins shifted from a dull, flickering glow to a steady, healthy pulse. Kai turned to them, crossing their arms. "Your models were close, but not close enough." Tilks stared at the human. This wasn't just intuition. This wasn't just knowledge. This was something else. And in that moment, Tilks finally understood the warning label. This human wouldn't just follow protocols. They would rewrite them. The human problem. Unorthodox thinking. The laboratory was silent. The soft hum of the biospheric study chamber was the only sound filling the air. Every set of alien eyes, bioluminescent, crystalline, and otherwise, was locked onto Kai Chen, the human specialist who had just rewritten the Horizon Seeker's environmental models in a matter of seconds. Tilks's mandibles twitched in agitation. The human's actions should have been a breach of protocol. And yet, it had worked. The bioluminescent plants, which had previously withered under supposedly optimal conditions, were now glowing with a steady vibrancy, their photosynthetic processes stabilized under Kai's newly calibrated parameters. Tilks turned toward Captain Vexa, expecting her to rebuke the human. Instead, her crystalline form shimmered with curiosity. Captain Vexa tilted her head toward Kai. "Your adjustments. How did you know the standard model was incorrect?" Kai exhaled, rubbing the back of their neck in a way Tilks recognized as a human habit of contemplation. "I didn't know for sure," Kai admitted, "but I had a hunch. Your simulation model assumes stability based on broad-spectrum conditions. It didn't account for the plant's evolutionary stress factors. This species comes from an unstable environment. It has evolved to thrive under constant change. Tilks frowned. That is not how controlled science works. Kai shrugged. Maybe not in your science, but for humans. Their lips curled into an expression Tilks was unfamiliar with. Confidence. Defiance. We figure things out by breaking them first. Tilks stiffened. That phrase was terrifying. The warning label wasn't enough. It had been only 2 hours since Kai Chen had stepped aboard the Horizon Seeker, and Tilks was already beginning to understand why their personnel file came with a warning label. The problem wasn't that Kai was reckless. The problem was that they were too effective. In Valkyrie research hierarchies, knowledge was systematic, structured, and derived from tested models. But Kai didn't test first. They acted. And somehow, impossibly, their instincts were correct. Tilks turned toward Captain Vexa, his bioluminescent skin shifting to a troubled green. Captain, we cannot allow a human to make unchecked modifications to the ship's research parameters. This is highly unorthodox. The captain's crystalline lattice pulsed in thought. Perhaps unorthodox is precisely what we require. Tilks's mandibles clicked in irritation. Captain. She raised a hand, cutting him off. First officer, your concern is noted. But consider this. What if our previous models had led to a failed experiment? How much time, how many resources would we have wasted before realizing our mistake? Tilks hesitated. The Valkyrie prided themselves on meticulous accuracy, but they also had a notorious flaw. They did not account for failure well. And failure was something humans seemed to be built for. Still, Tilks pressed, we cannot allow this level of unpredictability to disrupt our research. Captain Vex's glow shifted to a shade of quiet amusement. Then perhaps, first officer, we should not treat it as a disruption. Human adaptability in action. Kai had been on board for less than a day, and already the scientific division was splitting into factions. Some were fascinated by the human's uncanny ability to problem-solve on instinct. Others, like Tilks, found it deeply unsettling. But regardless of where they stood, everyone had to admit one thing. Kai got results. The human did not wait for permission. By the time Tilks had returned to the research bay, Kai had already adjusted 3 additional biospheric chambers, modifying growth conditions for xenobotanical samples the Valkyrie had struggled to cultivate for decades. Specialist Chen, Tilks snapped, approaching with thinly veiled frustration. What are you doing? Kai glanced up casually. Fixing your plants. Tilks bristled. You are altering controlled experiments without proper authorization. Kai sighed, rubbing their temples. Tilks, your models are great. Really, they are. But you're treating alien ecosystems like static equations. That's not how life works. Life is chaotic. Life is unpredictable. Tilks crossed his arms. And yet you assume your changes are correct. Kai smirked. Not always. That's why we experiment. Tilks hated how casual they made it sound. Science is not trial and error. Kai raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Tilks hesitated. Because, no, it wasn't supposed to be. But for humans, it was. The trouble with humans. By the end of Kai's first full cycle aboard, something became abundantly clear. The warning label hadn't been enough. Kai had already modified atmospheric conditions for plant samples that had failed for years. Suggested an experimental nutrient cycle that Valkyrie scientists were now running simulations on. Adjusted gravitational exposure settings on an experiment without permission, but had somehow prevented a critical mutation failure. And through it all, they never once acted uncertainly. Kai operated with unshakable confidence, as if their trial and error approach was a natural law of the universe. And disturbingly, it kept working. Tilks gathered his composure, seeking out Captain Vexa once more. Captain, he began cautiously, I believe we need a direct conversation about our human specialists' methods. Vex's crystalline form pulsed knowingly. You still do not trust them. Tilks sighed. It is not about trust. It is about predictability. There is no pattern to their decision-making process. Vexa tilted her head. Are you certain? Tilks hesitated. Then, slowly, his mind turned. What if there was a pattern? One they simply did not understand. A different kind of intelligence. As Kai walked into the next biospheric test room, Tilks silently observed them. He watched their hands move over the holographic controls, watched their brows furrow in thought before making seemingly random modifications. But the more he observed, the more uneasy he became. Because the modifications weren't random. Kai wasn't just guessing. They were recognizing patterns faster than their simulations could calculate. They were not working from logic alone. They were working from intuition, and intuition was something Valkyrie science had never accounted for. Tilks felt his bioluminescence flicker. Perhaps that was the real human problem. They weren't just unpredictable. They saw solutions before anyone else did, and that was far more dangerous. The experiment that should have failed. The unexplained success. For centuries, the Valkyrie scientific community had prided itself on precision and predictability. Every discovery, every breakthrough, was the result of meticulous planning, rigorous simulations, and controlled testing. Nothing was left to chance. Yet, somehow, this human, this Kai Chen, had succeeded where centuries of structured research had failed. And they had done it without formulas, without years of study, and without following standard procedure. First Officer Tilks sat rigidly in the research bay, watching as the latest plant sample, one that had never survived previous experiments, thrived under Kai's newly adjusted conditions. The scientific team stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the glowing biosphere. The results should have been impossible. The Valkyrie had studied this species of flora for over a century, attempting to cultivate it outside its homeworld's volatile environment. Every attempt had failed. The plants would wither, mutate, or collapse under stress. Yet now, under Kai's seemingly reckless alterations, the plant had stabilized. It should have failed, but it didn't. Tilks's mandibles clicked in frustration. He turned toward Kai, who was leaning casually against the console, arms crossed, watching the results with an infuriating lack of surprise. How? Tilks demanded. Did you know this would work? Kai tilted their head. I didn't. Tilks's bioluminescent skin flashed red in irritation. You mean to tell me you made an *** unauthorized modification to an ongoing experiment with no guarantee of success, and yet here we are. Kai's lips curled into that same infuriating human smirk. That's how science works, they said. Tilks bristled. That is not how science works. Kai shrugged. It is for humans. The difference between knowledge and instinct. Tilks turned away, struggling to make sense of the human's chaotic methodology. There was no structure to how Kai worked. There were no predictable patterns, no data models they followed. And yet, it kept working. The other scientists, the ones who had initially been skeptical, were now starting to listen. In the past few cycles alone, Kai had identified atmospheric stress factors in plant species that the Valkyrie had overlooked for decades, proposed a dynamic environmental model that adapted in real time rather than following static conditions, successfully cultivated xenoflora from extreme environments, breaking nearly a century of failed research. It wasn't just luck. There was a pattern. Kai didn't just solve problems. They felt their way through them. And that was what unsettled Tilks the most. The experiment that should have failed. 2 cycles later, a new test began. The Horizon Seeker had acquired a highly volatile plant specimen, one that had never survived outside its homeworld for more than 3 hours. The Valkyrie had tried everything: atmospheric recalibrations, genetic stabilizers, nutrient modifications, yet each time, the result was the same: decay, collapse, failure. Captain Vexa stood in the observation deck, watching as the latest attempt began. The laboratory was filled with scientists, Tilks among them, waiting to observe yet another inevitable failure. Kai, however, had a different idea. As the environmental systems powered up, Kai walked forward, studying the plant with intense focus. "You're already setting it up to fail," they muttered. Tilks's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Kai gestured toward the display. "You're trying to recreate exactly the conditions of its homeworld. That's the mistake." Tilks's bioluminescence flickered. "That is how we ensure environmental stability." Kai shook their head. "You're treating it like a static entity." "It's not. It's alive." Captain Vex's crystalline form pulsed in thought. "What do you suggest, Specialist Chen?" Kai's fingers flew across the console. The moment Tilks saw what they were doing, he lunged forward. "Stop. That will destabilize the entire system." Kai ignored him. They adjusted the temperature, raising it slightly above the known tolerance levels. They tweaked the gravity parameters, shifting them unpredictably every few minutes. They introduced controlled environmental fluctuations, subtle shifts in humidity, slight electromagnetic pulses. Tilks was furious. The conditions were now unstable, chaotic, exactly like the plant's homeworld. The scientists held their breath. 3 hours passed, then 4, then 6. The plant, which should have decayed long ago, remained alive. Then, to the horror of every Valkyrie scientist in the room, it began to bloom. Humanity's dangerous advantage. The room was silent. Tilks stared at the impossible sight in front of him. The plant, which had never survived more than 3 hours, had not only adapted, but was thriving. It had never been about creating a perfect environment. It had been about creating an environment where failure was a natural part of survival. The humans had evolved on a planet that never made sense, where conditions changed constantly, where stability was a luxury, not a rule. And so, over thousands of years, humans had stopped expecting stability. Instead of fighting against nature's chaos, they learned to move with it. Kai turned toward Tilks, their expression unreadable. "This is what your models were missing." Tilks could barely speak. The scientific models weren't wrong. They were simply built for a different kind of mind. A mind that needed order and predictability. Humans didn't. For them, chaos wasn't an obstacle. It was a tool, a weapon. And that meant every other species in the galaxy had been thinking about survival the wrong way. The captain's decision. Captain Vex's crystalline form glowed in approval. "I believe we owe you an apology, Specialist Chen," she said. Kai shrugged. "Don't worry about it. I'm used to it." That statement troubled Tilks more than anything else. "How?" he asked suddenly. Kai glanced at him. "How what?" Tilks stepped forward. "How can you just trust your instincts like that? How do you know when to push past failure instead of acknowledging it as a limit?" Kai studied him for a moment, then exhaled. "Because failure is how we learn. It's how we evolve." Tilks's stomach sank. That meant humans didn't fear failure. They embraced it. They weren't afraid to break things. And that made them the most dangerous problem solvers in the galaxy. Captain Vexa turned toward the crew. "Prepare for further research under Specialist Chen's modified parameters. I want full documentation of their method." Tilks swallowed hard. They weren't just studying the plants anymore. They were studying Kai. And by extension, they were studying humanity itself. Because if this was how humans approached science, then what did it mean for the rest of the universe?